The quiet nurse. Hook. The soldier was dying and nobody in the trauma bay could figure out why. His vitals were collapsing despite 2 IVs running wide open, despite a chest tube already placed, despite 3 physicians shouting over each other in Riverside Memorial's Trauma Bay 1. Blood everywhere. Monitors screaming. A special forces operator, 210 pounds of muscle and combat experience, turning gray on the table while the room descended into controlled chaos. And in the corner, standing absolutely still, was a nurse in blue scrubs who had seen exactly this before. Not in a hospital. On a battlefield. "Get us a real medic," one of the soldiers barked at her. She said nothing, just watched, and waited for the moment she already knew was coming. Before you find out what happens next, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. If you're watching this right now, hit like and follow so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's get back to Natalie Brooks and the night nobody in that hospital will ever forget. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. Natalie was charting at the nurses' station on the 3rd floor of Harwick General when the radio crackling through the trauma coordinator's desk announced a priority 1 incoming. Military patient, nature of injuries classified, ETA 6 minutes. She heard it the way she heard most things at work. Clearly, without reaction, filing it into the part of her brain that processed information before her face had a chance to respond. The charge nurse, a broad-shouldered man named Darren Voss, was already moving toward the elevator. "Brooks, you're on trauma assist tonight. They're pulling Kessler from the OR. Get down to Bay 1 and stay out of the way until you're needed." Stay out of the way. She had been hearing some version of that sentence for 3 years at Harwick General, and she had learned not to argue with it. Natalie saved her chart notes, grabbed her supply kit from under the desk, and took the stairs. Harwick General wasn't a bad hospital. It was a mid-sized facility in the industrial edge of Crestwood Falls, a city built on old manufacturing money and newer pharmaceutical plants, with a Level 2 trauma center that handled most of what the region threw at it. The staff were competent. Some of them were excellent. But the culture ran on hierarchy the way most hospital cultures did. Titles first, then credentials, then, somewhere far down the list, actual ability. Natalie had understood that within her first week and had adjusted accordingly. She was good at adjusting. The trauma bay was already filling when she pushed through the double doors. 2 residents from the surgical floor were pulling on gloves. A tech named Marcus was positioning the portable ultrasound unit. The attending physician on call, Dr. Harold Steck, stood at the head of the bay reviewing the incoming radio report on a tablet, his reading glasses pushed up into his thinning gray hair. Steck was 61 years old, 22 years in emergency medicine, with a reputation for controlled competence that occasionally shaded into the kind of rigidity that closed minds off to outside input. She had worked with him before. She knew how he operated. The ambulance bay doors blew open at 11:53. They came in fast. 2 paramedics running the stretcher, flanked by 4 men in military-issue tactical pants and base-layer shirts, no insignia visible, dog tags tucked. The kind of men who moved like the space around them belonged to them. The patient on the stretcher was large, well-muscled, early 30s, with a pale gray cast to his skin that Natalie recognized before she was close enough to read his vitals. His eyes were half open, unfocused. His breathing was wrong, shallow and fast in a way that wasn't matching the bleeding visible on his left shoulder and upper chest. The bleeding was real, but it wasn't the problem. GSW to the left shoulder, penetrating trauma to the upper chest wall, no exit wound. BP was 88/60 in the field. We pushed 2 liters of saline. Pressure came up to 104, but it's dropping again, the lead paramedic called out as they transferred to the bay table. Patient's name is Sergeant First Class Damon Pruitt. That's all they gave us. Steck moved in immediately. "Get me a chest x-ray, type and cross, CBC, BMP. Someone get another large bore IV going." The team moved. Natalie moved with them, positioning herself to the patient's right, where she could observe the chest rise and monitor the screen showing his continuous pulse oximetry. The oxygen saturation was reading 91 and declining slowly. His trachea, she noted, looked very slightly deviated to the right, almost imperceptible, the kind of thing you caught if you knew what you were looking for and you were looking in the right place. One of the soldiers, the one standing closest to the head of the bed, watching the team with the flat, assessing gaze of someone who spent his professional life evaluating threats, turned and looked directly at her. "Who are you?" "Natalie Brooks. I'm on trauma assist tonight." He looked at her scrubs, her plain lanyard badge, the ordinary supply kit clipped to her hip. His expression communicated exactly what he thought of that without him having to say anything. "We need a real medic in here, not a floor nurse." "I'm assigned to this bay," she said. He turned back to the table. Steck was running through his assessment, working quickly and with genuine skill, calling out findings as he went. The chest X-ray came back in under 3 minutes. Portable, not perfect resolution, but readable. Steck studied it and announced a likely hemothorax on the left side. He ordered a chest tube. Natalie watched the saturation tick down to 89. She watched the patient's breathing pattern, still fast, still shallow, the chest wall moving asymmetrically in a way that was subtle enough to miss if you were focused on the X-ray finding rather than the patient in front of you. The neck veins weren't distended yet. That was the confusing part. Classic teaching said tension pneumothorax showed distended neck veins, tracheal deviation, absent breath sounds. But classic teaching described the fully developed presentation, and Pruitt's body was compensating. He was young, he was fit, and his physiology was fighting the collapse instead of announcing it clearly. She looked at the monitor, heart rate 128, BP 97/64 and still trending down despite the fluids. She stepped slightly forward. "Dr. Steck?" He didn't look up from positioning for the chest tube. "Dr. Steck, I want to flag something on the breath sounds. I think... Brooks, let us work." That was Darren Voss coming in from the left, his voice carrying the particular tone of a charge nurse who considered himself a traffic manager as much as a clinician. "I hear decreased sounds on the left, but the quality is different than what you'd expect from a pure hemothorax. The trachea looks like it might be..." "The X-ray showed the hemothorax," Steck said, still not looking at her, positioning his needle. "That's what we're treating." The soldier who'd spoken to her earlier had moved to the wall to make room for the procedure. He caught her eye across the table and gave her a look that was half contempt, half dismissal. A stay-in-your-lane look. She'd gotten that look from soldiers before, too. She knew it well. She stepped back. The chest tube went in. Dark blood drained into the collection chamber. Steck nodded, confirmation of his diagnosis, visual evidence that the procedure was right. The team's posture loosened fractionally. Natalie watched the O2 saturation, 88, then 87. "Pressure," she said, to no one in particular. Marcus read the cuff. 91/58. The blood was draining, but the pressure was still dropping. The sat was still dropping. Pruitt's breathing was faster now, more labored, his accessory muscles working visibly. Something in his chest was still wrong, and the chest tube, which was correctly placed, which was draining appropriately, wasn't fixing it. She looked at the tracheal deviation again. Definitely right. Subtle, but real. A tension component. Developing alongside the hemothorax, probably from a parenchymal injury they hadn't imaged yet. The tube was addressing the blood, but not the air, and with every breath Pruitt took, the pressure differential in his chest was getting worse. She said it clearly. "There's a tension component. He needs needle decompression, left second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Right now." Steck turned and looked at her fully for the first time since she'd entered the bay. His expression was not angry. It was something flatter, and in some ways more dismissive. The look of a man who had decided before she finished the sentence that the source of the information disqualified the information. "That's not what the X-ray shows, Brooks." The X-ray showed what was already there. "The tension is developing. Look at his trachea. His trachea is midline. It's shifted right, minimally, but it's there. His SAT is 87 and dropping on high flow O2. His pressure is falling despite adequate fluid resuscitation and a well-placed chest tube. The presentation is atypical because he's young and compensating." The room had gone quieter, not completely quiet. Monitors still alarmed, the chest tube still drained, but the voices had stopped. Voss stepped in. Brooks, Dr. Steck is the attending on this case. If you have a concern, the appropriate what? She kept her voice level. The appropriate channel is to let him die while I fill out a form? That landed badly. She knew it would. She'd known it would before she said it, and she said it anyway because Pruitt's saturation was now reading 86, and the trend was unmistakable, and she was standing in a room full of people who were about to watch a man code because his nurse had gone through appropriate channels. Steck's jaw tightened. You're done here. Voss, get her out. Dr. Steck, out. Voss's hand closed around her arm. Not rough, but firm. And she let herself be moved toward the door because fighting it physically would cost her the last remaining option she had, which was to be in the room when the moment came. She stopped at the threshold. The soldiers were watching. Two of them had the expressions of men who had just seen the annoying variable eliminated from the equation. One of them, younger, dark-haired, standing near the equipment rack, was looking at her differently, with something more measured in his eyes, but she didn't have time to read into that. The monitor alarm changed pitch. Everyone in the room heard it simultaneously. Steck spun. Marcus called out the BP, 72/40. Then, 60 systolic, I'm losing it. Pruitt's body arched slightly on the table. A single involuntary movement, and then the heart rate trace on the monitor went from tachycardic to something ragged and irregular, and then the continuous tone that nobody wanted to hear in a trauma bay filled the room. Flatline. For exactly 3 seconds, the room froze. Not in panic, trauma teams don't panic, they've trained that out, but in the particular suspended beat that comes when a resuscitation pivots from management to salvation, when the margin of error collapses to nothing, when whatever you do next is either the thing that works or the last thing you try. Steck called CPR. A resident started compressions. The defibrillator was pulled. Someone pushed epinephrine. Natalie walked back into the room. Nobody stopped her this time. There was no one to stop her. Every hand was occupied. Every set of eyes was on the monitor or the patient, and in the reorganization that followed a cardiac arrest. The room had reshuffled into pure function, and she moved through it. The way she had moved through rooms like this before, in places where there were no defibrillators and no hospital beds, and the floor was sand or mud, and the man on it was wearing body armor. She went to the supply cart, left hand, second drawer. She knew the layout because she had made herself learn the layout of every trauma bay in this building in her first 2 weeks. She pulled a 14-gauge angiocath, 3.25 inches. She uncapped the needle. The younger soldier, the dark-haired one with the measuring eyes, was suddenly beside her. What are you doing? Needle decompression, second ICS, mid-clavicular. A beat. He looked at the needle, then at the patient, then back at her. You certain? Yes. He didn't move out of her way. He moved in closer, angling his body to give her access to the patient's left chest wall while simultaneously blocking anyone's direct line to stop her before she could complete the procedure. It was a small thing. It was a significant thing, she positioned. Landmarks. Second rib, up and over it, mid-clavicular. She felt the resistance of skin and subcutaneous tissue and intercostal muscle, and then the loss of resistance that meant she was in the pleural space, and then the hiss. Audible, sustained, unmistakable, air under pressure escaping from a chest cavity that had been slowly crushing a man's heart. The sound in the room changed. Not immediately. Resuscitations don't reverse that cleanly, but within 30 seconds, the heart rate trace on the monitor began to reorganize. Irregular to bradycardic to weak but present, and Steck's hands paused over the chest, and he called for a pulse check, and Marcus pressed 2 fingers to Pruitt's neck and said quietly, I've got something. The room breathed, the compression stopped. The trace settled slow, then steadier, then holding. 72 beats per minute and climbing. The saturation probe that had been reading flatline began to populate again, 79, 84, 88. Climbing. Natalie stepped back from the table. Her sleeve had ridden up during the procedure. The fabric had caught on the edge of the equipment cart, and the right cuff was pushed to the elbow, exposing the inside of her forearm, where a small tattoo sat in faded dark ink. A stylized caduceus overlaid with a specific insignia that was not decorative, not chosen for aesthetic reasons, not something available on any flash sheet in any tattoo shop in Crestwood Falls. It was a Special Operations Combat Medic Qualification Badge, the version worn by instructors of the qualification course. The younger soldier saw it first. He went very still. Then he looked at her face with entirely different eyes. She pulled her sleeve down, reached for a clean glove from the dispenser on the cart. He needs a thoracic surgeon. The needle will hold him for a few minutes, maybe 10. You need to move him now. She said it to Steck, not to the soldiers, because Steck was still the attending and the decision was his, and she had zero interest in navigating what had just happened in this room. Not here. Not now. Steck stared at her for a long moment. His face did something complicated, a fast internal accounting happening behind the eyes of a man who was very good at his job and had just watched someone he'd dismissed save his patient from a mistake he hadn't seen coming. He said nothing. Then he turned to the team. Get me thoracic on the phone. Prep for immediate OR transfer. Marcus, call surgery and tell them we're coming now. He looked at Natalie once more, brief, unreadable. And then he walked with his patient toward the OR corridor. The room emptied quickly, in the way trauma rooms empty after a crisis. Fast, purposeful, people peeling off toward their next task. The particular efficiency of medical professionals moving on because the work demands it, and there's no time for processing. The soldiers didn't move. All 4 of them were still in the bay. The one who had told her to stay in her lane was standing with his arms at his sides and an expression on his face that had lost all of its earlier certainty. The young dark-haired one who had blocked for her was looking at her with something that might have been recognition, not of her face, but of something he'd seen in how she moved and thought and worked. He said, "That insignia on your arm. It's a tattoo." "I know what it is." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "The SOMC instructor badge. That's not something people outside the pipeline would have. That's not something people fake." She didn't answer. "I served under an instructor named Brooks at Bragg 7 years ago. We called her the surgeon because she could do more with a field kit than most ORs could do with full equipment. I was a first cycle candidate." He paused. "She washed 3 guys out of my class on day 1 for not taking a patient assessment seriously enough. Said if they couldn't pay attention to what was in front of them, they'd get their teammates killed." Natalie pulled on the clean glove, straightened her supply kit. "Pruitt's going to need someone in that OR corridor," she said. "His pressure was still labile when they moved him. Make sure they know he's been hypotensive for more than 20 minutes. "Are you her?" She picked up the contaminated sharps from the cart and walked to the biohazard disposal at the wall. "I'm the nurse on trauma assist," she said. "You should go check on your man." She walked out. The corridor outside Trauma Bay 1 was quiet at this hour. The particular 1 a.m. quiet of a mid-sized hospital. The hum of ventilation and the occasional soft announcement over the PA and the distant sound of a call light that someone would get to in a minute. Natalie walked to the family restroom at the end of the hall, went inside, locked the door, turned on the water, and stood over the sink for a moment with her hands braced on the basin. The adrenaline was still in her blood. It always took a few minutes to clear. She had not intended to perform that procedure. She had intended to observe, to flag, to use appropriate channels, to be the responsible version of herself that 3 years in civilian medicine had trained her to be. She had tried that. The appropriate channels had told her to get out of the room while a man's chest collapsed around his heart. She'd made a different call. She splashed water on her face, looked at herself in the mirror for a moment, the face she showed at work every day. The ordinary face of a nurse in blue scrubs with sensible shoes and a plain badge, and no reason for anyone to look twice at her. She had worked to build that face. She had needed it to be ordinary. It wasn't going to be ordinary after tonight. She dried her hands, checked her watch. Pruitt would be in the OR for at least 2 hours, probably 3. There was nothing more she could do for him tonight. What she could do was go back to her floor, finish her charting, and figure out in the morning what tonight's decisions would cost her. Because they would cost her something. She knew that. Voss had seen her defy a direct order from an attending. Steck had seen her perform an invasive procedure without authorization. Those were not small things in a civilian hospital. Those were the kind of things that generated incident reports and HR meetings, and depending on how Steck decided to frame the night's events, potentially much worse. She had known that before she picked up the needle. She had made the call anyway. That was the problem with training you could never fully unlearn. It kept making the decision for you, the one where the mission comes first and the politics come later, and later kept arriving in the form of consequences she was getting tired of managing. She unlocked the bathroom door and walked back toward the stairwell. Darren Voss was waiting in the corridor. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had spent the last 10 minutes rehearsing what he was going to say and was now delivering it with the controlled precision of someone who understood that what he was doing wasn't entirely comfortable, but was entirely necessary. "We need to talk," he said. "I know. What you did in there saved his life." He paused. That acknowledgement hung between them for a moment, unresolved. "What you did in that bay was an unauthorized invasive procedure performed over the explicit objection of the attending physician. That is not something I can overlook because the outcome was good, Natalie. That is not how this works. If every nurse in this building started making unilateral calls on procedures, I flagged it twice. I was told to leave the room. You were told to leave the room, and you came back in. Because he arrested." "Because he arrested," Voss repeated. "And if he hadn't arrested, if Dr. Steck's management had been sufficient, you would have performed an invasive procedure on a patient without authorization." She looked at him steadily. He was going to arrest. The tension component was there. The findings were present. "I made a clinical judgment." "You are a nurse." She said nothing. "I'm not diminishing that," he said, and his voice shifted slightly. Less formal, more complicated. "You're a good nurse, but the scope of this role has limits for reasons that exist, and you went outside them tonight, and I have to report it. Steck is going to report it. That's where we are." "I understand. You may be suspended pending review. I want you to be prepared for that." She nodded. Voss uncrossed his arms. For a moment he just looked at her, not with judgment now, but with something more like genuine confusion, the expression of a man trying to reconcile what he'd expected with what had actually happened. "How did you know?" he asked. "The tension component, the presentation was atypical. Steck missed it, and he's been in emergency medicine for 20 years. How did you know?" She thought about how to answer that, about how much truth fit inside the answer she was allowed to give. "I've seen it before," she said. "The atypical presentation. I've seen what it looks like when a body is compensating well enough to confuse the textbook picture." He waited for more. She didn't give him more. "Go home," he said finally. "Come in tomorrow for the meeting. And Natalie—" He stopped. "What?" He shook his head slightly, as though the thing he was about to say didn't fit the framework of the conversation he'd been prepared to have. "Whatever you did before you came here," he said, "you weren't a floor nurse." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she walked to the stairwell and took the stairs up. The hospital quieted around her as she returned to her floor. Her charting was where she'd left it, cursor blinking in the medication field, the patient notes incomplete. She sat down and finished them with the systematic thoroughness that had always been her best professional armor, because whatever else happened, her documentation would be clean and accurate and unimpeachable. She had learned that early too. In environments where the after-action report mattered as much as the action. She clocked out at 2:15 a.m. The parking structure was nearly empty at that hour. Her car was a 7-year-old Honda in the color the catalog had called Lunar Silver, which was a generous name for gray. She unlocked it, got in, sat for a moment in the dark with the engine off. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. She didn't answer unknown numbers as a rule, but the call ended before she decided, and 30 seconds later a text appeared. "We know who you are. We'll need to speak with you. R. Calloway, LTC, USASOC." She stared at the message for a long time. Then she started the car. Across the parking structure, in a rental sedan parked near the exit ramp, the young dark-haired soldier named Garrett Hale sat with his phone in his hand and watched her taillights disappear into the night. He had been on the phone for the past 40 minutes. The conversation had gone in the direction he'd expected after he'd sent the message to his commanding officer describing the woman in Trauma Bay 1. The tattoo, the procedure, the way she'd moved. The response had come back fast. Faster than he'd expected. Which meant someone at a level above his knew exactly who Natalie Brooks was and had been waiting and was not surprised. Hale put the phone in his pocket and started his own engine. Whatever had just surfaced in a trauma bay in Crestwood Falls had been under the water for a long time. He drove toward the hospital exit and made the call to his CO that he'd been holding off. "Sir," he said when it connected, "I found her." "Sir," he said when it connected, "I found her." The drive home took 11 minutes. Natalie knew the route so well she could have run it blind. Left out of the hospital structure, down Mercer Avenue past the shuttered diner and the 24-hour pharmacy, right on Caldwell, then into the neighborhood of small houses and older trees that she had chosen specifically because it was unremarkable. The kind of street where nobody remembered your car or your schedule. She had chosen it the way she chose most things about her life here, deliberately, and for reasons she didn't discuss. The text from Calloway sat in her phone's message thread like something radioactive. She hadn't replied. She hadn't decided whether she would. She parked in the driveway, went inside and stood in her kitchen for a minute in the dark before she turned the light on. The kitchen was clean. She kept everything clean the way people kept things clean when they needed at least one part of their environment to be controllable. She put water on the stove for tea she wouldn't end up drinking and sat at the small table near the window where she could see the street. Nobody outside. Just the orange glow of the streetlight and a neighbor's sprinkler that had been running on a broken timer for 2 weeks. She looked at the text again. R. Calloway, LTC, USASOC, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Army Special Operations Command. She had known 2 Calloways in her career. Neither of them had been a Calloway she wanted finding her at 2 a.m. after a trauma bay incident in a civilian hospital. The fact that this one had her number and knew her location told her something. The fact that they'd moved this fast told her more. Someone had been watching, or at least watching for something like tonight to happen. She set the phone face down on the table. The thing about disappearing was that it only worked until it didn't. She had been careful. She had been careful in ways that most people didn't understand required any effort at all. The deliberate mediocrity at work, the suppressed instincts, the swallowed corrections, the 3 years of staying in her lane so consistently that Darren Voss had written in her last annual evaluation that she was reliable and steady, though perhaps underutilizing her capabilities. That line had made her laugh, alone in her car in the hospital parking structure, the kind of laugh that didn't have much humor in it. Tonight she had stopped being careful. Tonight she had chosen a man's life over her own architecture, and now the architecture was showing cracks. She went to bed at 3 a.m. and slept 4 hours, which was usually enough. Bummed. The meeting was at 9. She wore the same kind of scrubs she always wore. Blue, no embellishment, practical pockets. She drove to the hospital in the same gray Honda and parked in the same employee section and walked through the same service entrance she used every morning. The only difference was the hour, because her shift didn't start until 11, and she was arriving 2 hours early to sit in a conference room with people who were going to tell her something she already knew. Voss was there. Steck was there, which she'd expected. What she hadn't fully expected was the presence of the hospital's risk management director, a compact woman in her early 50s named Patricia Wren, who sat at the head of the table with a yellow legal pad and the particular alertness of someone whose job it was to calculate exactly how much a situation could cost. There was a fourth person she didn't recognize, a man in his mid-40s, unremarkable looking in a light gray suit, no hospital ID badge, who sat slightly back from the table in the way that people sat when they were there to observe rather than participate. She noted him and filed it. "Sit down, Natalie," Voss said. She sat. Steck looked worse than she'd expected. Not angry, she'd braced for angry, but something more complicated. He had the look of a man who had spent the night not sleeping and had arrived at a position through that sleeplessness that he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Wren opened the meeting with the formality of someone reading from a script they'd written before the relevant people arrived. Unauthorized invasive procedure. Violation of scope of practice as defined by the Nursing Practice Act. Direct insubordination to the attending physician of record. She read the list with the practiced evenness of someone who dealt with institutional liability daily and had learned not to let their own reactions complicate the delivery. Natalie listened. She didn't interrupt. She had learned in her previous life that the most tactically sound behavior in an interrogation, a debrief, or a disciplinary meeting was to let the other side say everything they had prepared to say before you responded to any of it. When Wren finished, she looked up. Do you have anything to say before we discuss next steps? Yes. Natalie folded her hands on the table. Sergeant Pruitt's presenting findings were consistent with a tension pneumothorax developing concurrent with the hemothorax identified on chest X-ray. His oxygen saturation had fallen to 86 on high-flow O2. His pressure was declining despite adequate fluid resuscitation and a correctly placed chest tube, and his trachea showed minimal but visible rightward deviation. I flagged these findings to Dr. Steck twice and was directed to leave the bay. When the patient arrested, I performed needle decompression because it was the indicated intervention and no one else was doing it. He has a pulse. He's alive. Silence. Wren made a note. Steck said, I'm not here to dispute that the procedure was clinically appropriate. She looked at him. I'm here because it creates a significant liability problem, he continued. Even when the outcome is good, even when the nurse was right and the doctor was... He stopped. Rubbed the back of his neck. It doesn't matter. The framework exists for reasons. The framework nearly killed him, she said. I know that. He said it flatly, quietly, the way a person said something they'd been arguing with themselves about since approximately 1 a.m. I'm aware of that. Wren stepped in before the silence extended. The hospital's position at this time is a suspension pending full review. Administrative leave with pay, effective immediately, while we assess... How long? Natalie asked. That depends on the review process, likely 2 to 4 weeks. 2 to 4 weeks. She did the math without showing it on her face. Rent was covered for a month. Her emergency fund was in a savings account she hadn't touched in 2 years. She could survive it. There's also the question, Wren continued, of your licensure. Given the nature of the violation, we're required to submit a report to the state nursing board. The board will conduct its own review. She'd known that was coming. She still felt it land. That process can take 3 to 6 months, Wren said, with something that might have been an apology embedded in the efficiency of her delivery. During that time, you would be permitted to work in a non-clinical capacity, but... I understand, Natalie said. The man in the gray suit shifted slightly in his chair, just slightly, but she caught it. Is there something you want to add? She said, and directed it at him. He looked at her with steady, unremarkable eyes. No, I'm just here in an observational capacity. Observational for whom? A pause. The hospital's insurance carrier. She looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable, and he held it without flinching, which told her he was either very practiced at this or he actually was from an insurance company. She decided it was probably the first thing. After the meeting, Wren handed her a 2-page suspension letter in a sealed envelope and told her to turn in her badge at the security desk. Voss walked her out, which she appreciated. It was the kind of consideration that said, I'm doing this because I have to, not because I want to. And at the security desk, he paused while she removed the lanyard and set the badge on the counter. For what it's worth, he said, low enough that the desk attendant couldn't hear, Steck's incident report characterizes your procedure as clinically indicated. He didn't throw you under the bus. She looked at him. He also didn't defend you, Voss added, because he was an honest enough man to complete the sentence. But he didn't make it worse. Okay, she said. She walked out through the main lobby, through the automatic doors, into a gray October morning that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to rain. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. No badge, no shift to go to. Her car in the parking structure and nowhere she was required to be. Her phone buzzed. Different number this time, but the same area code as last night's text. She answered it. Brooks, a woman's voice, dry, direct, the kind of voice that had spent years in rooms where directness was the only viable currency. This is Colonel Renata Calloway. I think you've been expecting this call. I've been expecting it since about 1 this morning. Yes. Garrett Hale tells me you ran a needle decompression with nothing but landmarks and a 14-gauge IV catheter on a man in full arrest and brought him back. That's what happened. He also tells me you knew Pruitt's specific physiological compensation pattern before the crash, that you called it and were dismissed. Also accurate. A brief pause. Not hesitation, calculation. The silence of someone deciding how direct to be, which was different from someone deciding whether to be direct at all. I want to meet with you, Calloway said. Today if possible. There's a situation developing that involves you whether or not you agree to that meeting, and I'd rather you be informed than surprised. What kind of situation? The kind that doesn't stay contained to a trauma bay. Natalie watched a car pull out of the hospital parking structure. A woman in scrubs hurrying to her shift, coffee in one hand, badge in the other. Where? She said. The diner Calloway named was on Route 9, 20 minutes outside Crestwood Falls, in a stretch of highway that served truck traffic and early morning commuters and not much else. It was called the Meridian, which was a large name for a small building with 8 booths and a counter and a coffee machine that had probably been new in the mid-90s. Natalie arrived 12 minutes early out of habit and took the booth in the back corner where she could see both the entrance and the service door. Calloway arrived exactly on time, which told Natalie she'd also arrived early and spent the first 12 minutes in the parking lot. She was tall, late 40s, with the kind of posture that didn't come from yoga, but from years of wearing body armor and postures that precluded slouching. Her hair was gray at the temples and not dyed, and she wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, a field jacket, with the particular discomfort of someone who wore a uniform most of their waking hours and hadn't quite adjusted to the absence of it. She scanned the room when she came in. Her eyes found Natalie before she was halfway through the door. She slid into the booth across from her. "You look exactly like your file photo," she said. "Which file?" A short pause. "Fair point, the more recent one." The server came. They both ordered coffee and nothing else, which the server received with the philosophical indifference of someone who'd been doing this long enough to know that some customers only ever ordered coffee. "I'm going to be direct," Calloway said, wrapping both hands around the mug when it arrived. "Good. Pruitt is out of surgery. He's in the ICU at Harwick, and he's stable. That's the first thing." Natalie let out a breath she hadn't been holding consciously. "The second thing is that what happened last night is not an isolated incident for us. Pruitt is the third operator from his unit to present at a civilian facility in the past 6 weeks with injuries described as training-related. The first 2 were treated and released. Pruitt nearly died." She turned the mug slightly on the table. "Someone is hiding something about what these men are doing and what's happening to them. The injuries don't match the training scenarios on record." Natalie looked at her. "That's a very large thing to tell a suspended nurse you've never met." "I'm telling you because you already saw enough of Pruitt's injury pattern last night to have formed your own opinion about it. And I'd rather have that opinion on the table than have it walking around unsupervised." It was a blunt way to put it. It was also accurate. "The wound entry pattern on his shoulder," Natalie said slowly, "it wasn't consistent with a training accident. The angle, the depth, the associated soft tissue damage. It looked more like someone knew where to put it," Calloway said. Silence. Outside, a semi rolled past on Route 9, rattling the window slightly in its frame. "There's more," Calloway said. "The classified training operation Pruitt was part of is run out of a joint facility 40 miles from here. The medical support on that operation is contracted out. Not military medical, not SOCOM, credentialed, private contractor. And the name of the company running that medical contract is interesting." "Interesting how?" Calloway reached into her jacket pocket and slid a folded piece of paper across the table. Not printed, handwritten. Which meant she hadn't wanted a record in any system of this specific piece of information being transmitted. Natalie unfolded it. The company name was Verrill Medical Group. Below it was a name, Dr. Owen Steck. She looked up. "Harold Steck's brother," Calloway said. "Verrill Medical Group has held the medical support contract for the training facility for 14 months. Owen Steck is the on-site medical director. Harold Steck's hospital is where the injured operators have been going." Natalie sat with that for a moment. "That's not proof of anything," she said. "No, it's not. But it is the kind of alignment of interest that people who are hiding something find very useful." Calloway took a drink of her coffee. "The incident reports that came out of the first 2 operator injuries, filed by Harwick General, described the injuries as consistent with training accidents, which kept the contractor's record clean, which kept the contract in place. And Pruitt's injuries were worse, more visible, harder to explain as training related. If he had died at Harwick General and the cause of death was documented as a preventable medical error rather than whatever actually happened to him, His injury history would never have been reviewed. The word preventable sat in the conversation like a stone dropped in still water, sending rings outward in every direction. He nearly did die, Natalie said. Yes, he very nearly did. And the medical error that nearly killed him was made by the brother of the man whose company has a financial interest in those injuries staying misclassified. Calloway set the mug down. I'm not saying Harold Steck knew. I'm saying the structure exists, and I'm saying that your suspension, effective this morning, filed within hours of you being the person who prevented his death, is interesting timing. Natalie folded the paper and set it back on the table between them. Her coffee had gone cold. She hadn't touched it. She was running the connections in her mind the way she had been trained to run them. Not in a straight line, but in a network, each node connected to the others, testing the points where the network was strongest and where it was most likely to fail. Calloway's theory was architecturally sound. It didn't require conspiracy to hold together, just convergence, a contract, a family relationship, a hospital culture that had reinforced dismissing an inconvenient voice at the worst possible moment. The inconvenient voice being hers. What do you need from me? She asked. First, I need to know if you're willing to talk to the investigative team we're standing up. What you observed, Pruitt's wound pattern, the presentation, the decision-making in that trauma bay, is going to matter. You're the only one in that room last night who wasn't either complicit in missing it or too compromised to report it cleanly. I'll talk to them. Second, Calloway paused. I need to know why you left SOCOM. The question was direct and expected and still landed somewhere tender. That's not relevant. Respectfully, it is. Your record up to the point of separation is exceptional. Then you resign, decline placement, and turn up as a nurse in a mid-tier civilian hospital 3 states away. That is not a natural career arc, and whatever made it happen is going to come out in an investigation that touches your credibility. Natalie looked at the window, the truck traffic on Route 9, the gray sky that had decided on cloud cover rather than rain. I had a patient die, she said, on a training deployment, a candidate in the qualification course. He was 24. She said it the way she said most things that mattered, flatly, without decoration, because decoration was the thing that made simple truths harder to look at. The circumstances were under investigation. I was cleared. I left anyway. Calloway was quiet for a moment. I know about the investigation, she said. I read the file. Then you know how it ended. I know how the formal proceeding ended. I'm asking how it ended for you. That was a more perceptive question than she'd expected, which recalibrated her estimate of Calloway upward. It ended the way those things end, Natalie said, with a cleared record and a person who wasn't the same afterward. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The candidate's name was Marcus Webb, Calloway said, and the findings of the investigation attributed his death to a pre-existing cardiac condition that presented asymptomatically during the stress of the course. The medical team's response was assessed as appropriate. The file was closed. I know what the file says. Do you believe it? Natalie picked up her coffee. Cold. She drank it anyway. I believe he died, she said. I believe the investigation closed the way most investigations closed, with the answer that created the least downstream disruption. I believe I missed something in my pre-course screening that I shouldn't have missed, and I believe that whether or not the formal findings supported that, I wasn't able to keep training people who might die because I missed something. So you came here. I came here. Calloway turned the piece of paper over between her fingers. I'm going to ask you something else, and I need you to understand that your answer to this is going to shape how this investigation proceeds. Natalie waited. The third operator injury? Before Pruitt. A soldier named Rafi Odom, treated and released from Harwick 6 weeks ago for a rib fracture and soft tissue contusion described as a fall from a training obstacle. Odom is back on limited duty. His unit has been told not to discuss his medical status. Calloway placed both hands flat on the table. I talked to Odom yesterday. He told me that when he was being treated at Harwick, a nurse pulled him aside in the hallway and told him quietly that his injuries weren't consistent with a fall and that he should request a second opinion. He didn't. He was scared, and he was 22, and he just wanted to get back to his unit. She paused. He described the nurse as a woman in her late 20s, blue scrubs, dark hair, quiet voice. Said she seemed like she was trying to help but was careful not to be overheard. The Meridian Diner was quiet. Someone at the counter asked for a refill. The coffee machine hissed. "Was that you?" Calloway said. Natalie looked at her steadily. There were a dozen ways to answer a question like that, and most of them involved calibrating the answer to the risk rather than the truth. She was tired of calibrating. "Yes?" she said. Calloway exhaled slowly. It was the exhalation of someone who had suspected an answer and was still absorbing the reality of having it confirmed. "You knew something was wrong 6 weeks ago." "I knew the injury presentation didn't add up. I didn't know why. I flagged it to the only person I could flag it to without a rank structure behind me, which was the patient." "Why didn't you report it through the hospital?" Natalie looked at her. Calloway held up a hand. "Right. I know why." She did know why. Because the hospital was the problem, or at least part of it, and reporting up through a structure that was already compromised was the kind of move that accomplished nothing except alerting the people you were supposed to be reporting about. "I need you to be willing to go on record with what you observed about Odom's injuries," Calloway said, "and with everything from last night. I know that means your suspension becomes a more visible thing. I know it means your licensing review gets more complicated before it gets less complicated." She looked directly at Natalie. "And I know you didn't ask for any of this." "No," Natalie said. "I didn't." "But you're already in it." "I've been in it since Odom." She straightened in the booth. "What's the timeline?" "The investigative team arrives in Crestwood Falls tomorrow morning. Federal jurisdiction, NCIS, has been looped in given the military nexus. They'll want a full deposition. Separate from that, SOCOM is conducting its own review of the contractor's medical records, which Verrill Medical Group does not know about yet." "What about Harold Steck?" "He doesn't know what his brother may be involved in. We're working on the assumption of ignorance until we have evidence otherwise, but that assumption is fragile." "He's going to be questioned." "Yes, and when he is, the record of your suspension is going to be part of the conversation, which means his decision this morning is going to look very different in an investigation than it looked in a risk management meeting." Calloway picked up the folded paper and put it back in her jacket pocket. "The people who pushed you out of that room last night have an interesting few weeks ahead of them." Natalie thought about Voss telling her Steck hadn't thrown her under the bus. She thought about Steck's face in the meeting, the complicated reckoning of a man who had already begun to understand that something was wrong, even if he didn't know the full shape of it yet. She wasn't sure what she felt about Harold Steck. Anger was the obvious answer, but anger required a certainty about intent that she didn't have yet. What she had was evidence of a system that had dismissed her and nearly killed someone as a result, and evidence that the dismissal might not have been accidental. Those were different problems requiring different responses. She slid out of the booth and stood. "I'll be available tomorrow," she said. "You have my number." "One more thing." Calloway didn't stand yet. "Hale is going to want to talk to you, not as part of the investigation, personally. He was in your qualification course." Natalie looked at her. "Second cycle," Calloway said. "Not first. He told me he went through the course the year after Marcus Webb died. He knew Webb. They'd been in the same pre-deployment training. He said the instructors didn't talk about what happened, but everyone who went through that year knew something had changed in how the course was run." She paused. "He said whoever made those changes had probably saved lives. He didn't know the instructor's name." Natalie said nothing. She walked to the counter and left a $10 bill next to both coffee cups, and then she walked out into the gray October morning and sat in her car and stared at the parking lot of the Meridian Diner for a long time before she started the engine. The changes she'd made after Marcus Webb died, the revised screening protocols, the additional stress indicators added to the pre-course medical assessment, the mandatory 24-hour observation window she'd instituted over the objection of her superiors before she resigned, she had never known if they'd stayed in place. She'd left without looking back, because looking back was the thing that made the leaving impossible. Calloway had just told her they had stayed in place. She sat with that. Her phone buzzed again. She looked at the screen, expecting Calloway or Hale or possibly Voss with some administrative follow-up. It was a Crestwood Falls number she didn't recognize. She answered. "Miss Brooks, A man's voice. Not military, civilian, with the careful enunciation of someone who had been taught to speak in ways that sounded authoritative without being confrontational. My name is Raymond Gill. I'm the legal counsel for Varel Medical Group. Her hand tightened slightly on the phone. We understand you've been suspended from your position at Harwick General following last night's incident, Jill continued. We also understand that you may be in contact with certain parties conducting inquiries related to our operations. We'd like to discuss the situation with you before those inquiries proceed further. We believe there may be a resolution that serves everyone's interests. She looked through the windshield at the diner, where Calloway was still visible through the window, still at the booth, still holding her coffee. What kind of resolution? She asked. A generous severance arrangement, full legal support for your nursing board review, and a written acknowledgement from Harwick General that last night's outcome was a result of team effort rather than individual unauthorized action. The offer was specific enough to have been drafted in advance. The severance, the board support, the reframing of last night, each component targeted an exact vulnerability she had woken up with this morning, which meant they had known about the suspension before it happened, or they had moved very fast once it did. Either way, they had resources and reach, and someone who understood exactly where she was exposed. She said, I'll need to consult with my own legal counsel before I respond to any offer. Of course, we just encourage you to move quickly. These situations have a tendency to, a pause, develop. She ended the call. Through the diner window, Calloway was watching her, and from the expression on the older woman's face, she could see that Calloway had been watching since Natalie sat down in the car and hadn't moved for 5 minutes. Natalie pulled up her recent calls and pressed the button to call Calloway back, even though she could see her through the glass 30 feet away. Calloway answered on the first ring. Varel Medical Group just called me, Natalie said. They offered me money to stay quiet. A beat. How much? Calloway asked. They didn't specify. Then the number is large enough that they didn't want to say it out loud. Another pause, shorter. When did they call? 2 minutes ago. We may have less time than I thought. Calloway's voice had shifted. The assessment was faster, tighter, the tone of someone recalculating margins. Brooks, I need you to listen to me carefully. Do not go home tonight. The words hit Natalie with a cold clarity she recognized from the part of her life she had tried to leave behind. The specific clarity of a situation reclassifying itself from complicated to dangerous. What's happened? She said. Odom, Calloway said. The operator I told you about. The one you warned 6 weeks ago. He was found this morning at his off-base apartment. Someone had been through it. He's not injured, but he's rattled, and the message is clear. Natalie looked at Route 9. The trucks moving through. A perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning in a town that didn't know any of this was happening inside it. They know he talked to me, she said. They knew before I did. Calloway's voice was even, but underneath it was something taut and urgent that Natalie recognized because she had sounded like that herself, more than once, in situations where the timeline was compressing and the variables were multiplying faster than the solutions. Which means they have a source inside SOCOM, or inside the investigative coordination, and we don't know which one yet. Natalie stared at the windshield. The adrenaline from last night hadn't fully cleared. Now it spiked again, fresh and sharp, resaturating her blood with the particular chemistry of someone who had been in this place before, in the field, in the dark, with information that mattered, and a timeline shrinking around her. Where should I go? She said. Calloway gave her an address. A safe house, military adjacent, on the edge of Crestwood Falls near the old industrial corridor. She said Hale would be there. She said to get there before noon and not to use her GPS. Natalie memorized the address. She didn't write it down. Calloway? She said before she ended the call. The man in the gray suit at my suspension meeting this morning. He said he was from the hospital's insurance carrier. A pause. Can you describe him? She did. Height, build, approximate age, the specific way he sat at the table. Calloway was silent for longer than she'd been silent at any point in the conversation. Get to the address, she said. Right now. Natalie started the engine. She pulled out of the Meridian's parking lot without signaling and drove north on Route 9 with her eyes on the rearview mirror. No GPS. She ran the address Calloway had given her through her memory the way she'd run grid coordinates once. Landmark to landmark, turn to turn, the old method that didn't leave a data trail and didn't rely on a device that could be queried. She'd driven these roads enough times to know the industrial corridor Calloway meant, the stretch of Crestwood Falls where the old smelting plants had closed in the 90s and left behind a grid of wide empty streets and warehouse buildings that the city had half-heartedly rezoned for mixed commercial use without anything actually moving in. She took the long route, 14 minutes instead of 8. She made 3 unnecessary turns and watched each time to see what followed her. A white Hyundai turned with her twice before taking an exit. Probably nothing. She noted the plate anyway. The safe house was a unit in a converted warehouse on Dellard Street, indistinguishable from the 8 units flanking it. Metal door, no signage, a loading dock that hadn't seen a delivery in years. She parked 2 buildings down and walked. Old habit. She felt the slight absurdity of it. A woman in blue scrubs walking through an industrial district at 10 in the morning, and walked anyway, because the absurdity was less dangerous than the alternative. Hale opened the door before she knocked. He'd changed out of his tactical pants into jeans and a gray long sleeve, which made him look younger and slightly less like a threat assessment. He stepped aside to let her in without saying anything. The space inside was functional and bare. Folding table, 4 chairs, a laptop running on external power, a whiteboard on the far wall covered in names and dates and connecting lines drawn in red marker. A second man was sitting at the table. 30s, lean, with the build of someone who stayed fit for reasons rather than aesthetics, and a forearm brace on his left wrist. He looked at her when she came in, the way people looked at someone they'd heard a great deal about. "Rafi Odom," he said. "I know," she said. He didn't seem surprised that she recognized him. His apartment had been turned over this morning, and he was sitting in a safe house in the industrial corridor of a city he'd been told to stay away from, and he had the expression of a man who had passed through scared and arrived somewhere beyond it. Not calm, exactly, but resolved in the way that people got resolved when the options had narrowed enough that the path forward was the only one remaining. "You told me 6 weeks ago that my ribs didn't come from a fall," he said. "I did. I should have listened." "You're here now," she said. Hale closed the door and came to the table. He pulled up something on the laptop and turned the screen toward her. Medical records. Verrill Medical Group's incident documentation for 3 separate training injuries, Odom's and 2 others she didn't have names for yet. She scanned them. The documentation was clean in the way that things were clean when someone had spent time making them clean. The language precise, the injury classifications consistent with training accidents, each report signed off by Owen Steck as the on-site medical director. But the injury descriptions were wrong. She could see it immediately because she'd seen Odom's presentation firsthand and she'd seen Pruitt's, and the gap between the documented mechanism and the actual wound pattern was not the kind of gap that happened by accident. A training fall from a 6-foot obstacle did not produce the specific compression pattern she'd seen on Odom's ribs. A ballistic simulation round did not produce the wound channel present in Pruitt's shoulder. The equipment being used on these men in the field was not the equipment on record, and the injuries were being systematically misclassified before they left the training site. "Owen Steck falsified these," she said. "We believe so," Hale said. "We're 2 days from having enough to prove it. The problem is that someone inside SOCOM coordination knows we're 2 days out." The source Calloway mentioned. "Yeah." He turned the laptop back. "The gray suit from your meeting this morning to..." Calloway ran the description. "His name is Dennis Farr. He's a private investigator contracted by Verrill's legal team. He's been embedded in Harwick General's administrative structure as a risk management liaison for the past 3 weeks, which means he had access to incident documentation and personnel files. He knew about my suspension before it happened. He may have facilitated it. We don't know the full extent of his access yet." Hale's jaw was tight. "What we know is that Verrill's legal team moved to contain you within 6 hours of Pruitt being admitted. That's not a coincidence, and it's not a standard liability response. They needed you discredited before the investigation formalized, because your observations about Odom and Pruitt, documented and on record, put the falsified incident reports in direct conflict with a credible clinical witness." Odom shifted in his chair. They're not going to stop at discrediting. Nobody responded to that, which was itself a response. Natalie looked at the whiteboard, the names and lines. Varl Medical Group at the top, with Owen Steck's name to the left and Farr's name to the right. Harold Steck in a separate cluster, connected to his brother with a dotted line that indicated relationship without confirmed complicity. Several other names she didn't recognize. Administrators, possibly, or contractors. And in the lower left corner of the board, connected to Odom's name by a red line with a question mark at the midpoint. Her own name. Natalie Brooks. Written in the same marker as everything else, the same clinical shorthand of an investigation mapping its own moving parts. She hadn't expected to see herself on a whiteboard. It shouldn't have surprised her. She had walked into the edges of this 6 weeks ago when she'd pulled Odom aside in a Harwick hallway and told him the truth. She had moved to the center of it last night when she'd picked up a 14-gauge catheter and made the call that changed Pruitt's outcome. She was not a bystander who had stumbled in. She was a variable the other side had decided needed to be neutralized, which meant she had already been recruited by her own actions without being asked. That thought sat in her chest with an uncomfortable weight. The NCIS team, she said. When do they arrive? Tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. Hale closed the laptop. But Calloway got a message 20 minutes ago. Someone tipped Varel's legal team about the federal jurisdiction request. They know NCIS is coming, which means tonight they move whatever they're going to move, she said. Yes. Owen Steck. He's at the training facility right now, 40 miles out. There are 2 more operators currently in the field under his medical supervision. Hale looked at her directly. If Varel decides that cleaning house before federal agents arrive is the better option, those 2 men are alone out there with a contractor medical team that has already demonstrated it doesn't have their interests as the priority. The room was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of a situation that had just clarified itself into something that required a decision rather than more analysis. Natalie stood up. I need a phone that isn't mine, she said, and I need whatever medical kit you have in this building. Hale looked at her. You're not going out there. There are 2 operators in a field environment with a compromised medical support chain and a federal investigation that doesn't move until 7 tomorrow morning. She said it evenly, without drama, the way she had always said things that were both obvious and difficult. I'm a suspended nurse with no active clinical authority and 6 years of combat medical training. You tell me who else you have. He didn't answer that. Because there wasn't an answer. Odom pushed back from the table and stood. I know the facility layout. I was there 3 weeks ago. You're on limited duty with a wrist brace, she said. I can navigate. I don't need to do anything else. He looked at her steadily. And those are my guys out there. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at Hale. Hale was already reaching for the phone. He was mid-dial when his own phone lit up with an incoming call. Calloway's number. He answered it on speaker and set it on the table between them. Calloway's voice came through without preamble. We have a problem. Owen Steck left the training facility 20 minutes ago. He took the contractor medical vehicle and he's not responding to the facility coordinator. The 2 operators still in the field have no medical support. A pause. Half a beat. And I just got a report that someone accessed Natalie Brooks's home address from the Harwick General HR system at 9:47 this morning. The timestamp hit the room like a pressure change. 9:47. 40 minutes ago. While she had been sitting in the Meridian Diner drinking cold coffee. Is there someone at her house? Hale said. We don't know yet. We have someone moving to check. Calloway's voice was controlled, but the urgency underneath it was unmistakable. Brooks, everything you have at that house, anything that matters, assume you're not going back for it. Natalie thought about the house on Caldwell Street, the clean kitchen, the small table by the window, the go-bag she had kept packed in the back of her closet for 3 years, not out of paranoia, but out of a habit she'd never been able to fully put down. She hadn't brought it this morning. She had left it there because this morning she had still been the version of herself that lived on Caldwell Street and went to work at Harwick General and stayed in her lane. That version had expired. The operator's in the field, she said. Do we have a location? Grid coordinates, yes. Hale has them. Then we need to move before Steck or whoever he's working with decides those 2 men are a liability too. Calloway said nothing for a moment. The kind of nothing that was a commanding officer calculating risk tolerance against mission necessity, against the reality that the person on the other end of the call was already in motion regardless of the calculation. "Hale," she said finally. "Yes, ma'am." "Keep her alive." The call ended. Hale was already pulling a field kit from the cabinet under the whiteboard. Odom was lacing his boots. The warehouse was suddenly full of the specific, purposeful noise of preparation, and Natalie was standing in the middle of it, suspended nurse, 3 years removed from a career she'd tried to leave behind, with no badge and no authority, and a set of skills that had never actually stopped being relevant. She unzipped the field kit and began checking the contents with the fast, thorough efficiency of someone who had done this more times than she could count and knew exactly what she was looking for and exactly what would happen if it wasn't there. Her hands were steady. That, at least, had never changed. Outside on Dellard Street, a vehicle she hadn't seen before rolled past the warehouse at a speed that was not quite slow enough to be surveillance and not quite fast enough to be ordinary, and she heard it through the thin metal wall and noted it and kept moving because stopping was the one option that didn't exist anymore. Hale zipped his jacket and looked at her. "You ready?" She pulled on a glove, snapped it at the wrist. "I've been ready," she said, "for 6 years." They were halfway to the door when Odom's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and went very still. "It's one of the operators," he said. "The ones in the field." He put it on speaker. The voice that came through was young, mid-20s maybe, tight with the effort of staying controlled while something in the background that wasn't equipment noise and was not wind moved through the audio like something wrong. "Odom, we've got a situation out here. Reyes went down. I don't know what's wrong with him. It came on fast. He's barely conscious, and his pulse is—" A sharp breath. "The medic isn't responding. The vehicle's gone. And I don't know what to do. Odom, we've got a situation out here. Reyes went down." Natalie was already moving toward the field kit. "What's his breathing like?" she said, loud enough for the phone to pick her up. A half-second pause on the other end. The young soldier recalibrating to the fact that a voice he didn't recognize was now in the conversation. "Fast, shallow. He was complaining about his chest 20 minutes ago, and I thought it was the exertion. We were running a load-bearing circuit, and—" "Is he conscious?" "Barely. He's answering me, but he's not. He's not making full sense. His lips look wrong, kind of blue." "Is he on his back?" "Yeah. Roll him onto his left side, right now while we're talking. Support his head." Rustling, movement. A low sound from someone in the background that was not words. Okay, he's on his side." "Good. Don't move him again until I tell you. What's your name?" "Tanner. Corporal Wade Tanner." "Tanner, I need you to put your fingers on the side of his neck and count his pulse for 10 seconds. Tell me what you get." She was pulling items from the kit as she talked, not randomly, with purpose, building a picture in her head from what Tanner was describing. Cyanosis, altered consciousness, rapid shallow respiration following exertion in a man who had been under the medical supervision of Owen Steck. The differential was uncomfortably wide, and she couldn't examine Reyes from 40 miles away, but she could narrow it, and narrowing it started with what she could hear. Tanner counted. 14. "In 10 seconds?" "Yes." Heart rate of 84 per minute, roughly. Not the tachycardia she'd expected if this was purely cardiopulmonary. Something else then, or something mixed. "Has he been given anything today? Any injections, any medications? Anything the medic gave him before he left?" A pause that lasted 1 second too long. "Tanner? Steck gave both of us a shot this morning. Said it was a standard pre-exercise immunization. We've had them before." Natalie stopped moving. Behind her, she heard Hale stop moving too. "1 shot or 2, she said. "1 each." "Where? Which arm? Which site?" "Left shoulder, deltoid." She turned and looked at Hale. He was already on his own phone, moving toward the door with the particular contained urgency of someone translating a situation from concerning to critical in real time. Odom was by the wall with his jaw set and his eyes doing the math she was doing. A pre-exercise immunization administered by a contractor medical director the morning his employer's entire operation was about to be exposed by a federal investigation was not an immunization. "Tanner," she said, "did you get the same shot? The exact same one?" Yes, same vial. How do you feel right now? Tell me honestly. A breath. Tired. More than I should be. I thought it was the circuit. Any chest tightness? A little. I figured, sit down, right now. Get on the ground next to Reyes and don't exert yourself. You're going to stay on this phone with me. She looked at Odom. How far? 38 miles on the back route. Faster than the highway at this hour. We need to know what was in that vial. I know. He was already at the door. Hale had Calloway back on the phone, relaying what Tanner had said in the clipped, compressed shorthand of someone passing target information. 2 operators, possible pharmacological exposure. Suspect the contractor administered it. 1 symptomatic, 1 developing. She could hear Calloway's response from across the room without needing it on speaker, because Calloway's voice had the specific edge of a senior officer who had just heard something that moved a situation from investigation to emergency intervention. They were in the vehicle in 90 seconds. Hale drove. Natalie sat in the back with the field kit across her knees and Odom's phone propped against the seat back so she could keep Tanner talking. Tanner was 23 years old, she gathered from the conversation. He had the voice of someone who had trained extensively for physical threat and was encountering the disorientation of a threat that didn't come with a visible target. She kept him focused on Reyes, breathing rate, skin color, response to simple questions, any change in the cyanosis. Reyes was talking, but his answers were getting slower, which could mean hemodynamic compromise or neurological effect, or both. And without knowing what had been in the vial, she was navigating with her instruments half working. What's your medical kit situation? She said. Standard field first aid, tourniquet, pressure dressings, some airway stuff. No IV supplies. No IV access. No epinephrine. No atropine. Whatever Steck had given them, she was going to have to manage it with whatever was in the kit she'd pulled from the safe house wall. And the kit was good, but it wasn't an ICU. Talk to me about Reyes's history, she said. Anything. Allergies, prior conditions. Anything he's mentioned. He had a thing with his heart a couple years ago, said the docs cleared him. I don't know the details. Underlying cardiac history even resolved. That narrowed the differential and widened the concern simultaneously, because certain classes of pharmaceutical agents hit compromised myocardium harder and faster than healthy tissue. She worked the problem in silence for a moment while the industrial corridor of Crestwood Falls gave way to the 2-lane county road heading north. Haley? She said. Yeah. I need Calloway to get someone on the line at the training facility. Anyone still there? Coordinator, range safety, anyone. I need to know if there's a medication log from this morning. Steck would have documented the administration, at least on paper, because the alternative is no record at all, and that's worse for him if it ever came to light. She's already on it. I also need to know if there's a medical waste container at the facility. Used vials, syringes. If Steck left in a hurry, he might not have taken the waste with him. Hale relayed it without being asked a second time. Tanner's voice through the phone. Reyes just said his vision is blurry. Is he still on his side? Yes. Okay, put your hand on his chest and tell me if both sides are moving when he breathes. A pause. Yeah, both sides. Not a pneumothorax then, not a primary respiratory mechanical failure, which pushed the probability toward the pharmacological hypothesis harder. Tanner, I'm going to describe some symptoms. I need you to tell me yes or no for each one as they apply to Reyes. Don't interpret, just yes or no. Okay. Skin that's moist or sweaty? Yes. Pupils. Can you look at his eyes? Are they small? Smaller than they should be in this light? A moment. Yeah, they look small. Increased saliva. Is he drooling or swallowing a lot? He just swallowed. Keeps doing it. She had it. Meiosis, diaphoresis, hypersalivation, progressive muscle weakness, altered consciousness following exertion. The pattern was specific enough that the differential had collapsed to 1. Organophosphate compound, administered intramuscularly. The exertion had accelerated systemic absorption and distribution, which was why Reyes had gone down first. He'd pushed harder on the circuit, metabolized the compound faster, hit the threshold sooner. Tanner was behind Reyes on the curve by maybe 30 to 40 minutes, depending on his body mass and exertion level. His fatigue and chest tightness were the opening symptoms. Without intervention, he would follow the same trajectory. She needed atropine. Hale, the kit. Is there any atropine in there? He glanced in the rear view. Check the outer left pocket. There should be a combat pill pack. She unzipped it, rummaged, found a sealed pouch marked for military field use, tore it open. 2 auto-injector units. Not the dosing she would have chosen, but the mechanism was right. Intramuscular delivery, fast onset, enough to block the muscarinic effects long enough to keep a man breathing until he could get to a hospital. 2 injectors. 2 men. If the dosing held. Tanner, she said, I need you to do something that's going to feel like a lot. Tell me. There's a medication in our kit that can help Reyes. We're approximately 25 minutes out. I'm going to tell you exactly how to administer it and where. If you follow my instructions precisely, you can buy him the time he needs until we get there, but I need to know if you can stay calm enough to do this. A beat. I've applied tourniquets under fire, Tanner said. This is easier than that. She wasn't sure that was true, but it was what he needed to hear. Listen carefully. She walked him through it, the outer thigh, mid-lateral, through the fabric, the auto-injector mechanism, the pressure and hold time. He did it without flinching, or if he flinched, he didn't let her hear it in his voice, and 30 seconds later he said, Done. Good. Now tell me if his breathing changes over the next 5 minutes. She looked out the window. Fields and tree lines. The county road was mostly empty at this hour, and Hale was driving with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that the margin was real and that speed mattered without requiring it to be said. Odom, in the passenger seat, had been quiet since they'd left. Not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say, but the quiet of someone managing something internal, the particular compression of a person who had been on the receiving end of the situation 6 weeks ago and was now watching it happen to people he'd served with. His left hand was flat on his knee, and his jaw was tight, and he was staring at the road ahead with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite something softer, but something in between that didn't have a simple name. It wasn't an immunization 6 weeks ago either, he said. Not a question. She didn't answer immediately. What did Steck give you? She said. He said it was a prophylactic, standard contractor protocol before a new training environment. He paused. I felt off for 3 days afterward. I figured it was the physical load. Did you report it? To who? Steck was the medical authority on site. She thought about that. Owen Steck, operating as the on-site medical director for a private contractor, with unrestricted access to the operators under his care, and a financial incentive to keep the injury record clean. Organophosphate compounds in sublethal doses produce symptoms, fatigue, muscle weakness, cognitive fog, that looked like overtraining and stress response. They were difficult to identify without specific blood testing and nearly impossible to distinguish from physical exhaustion without a provider who was specifically looking for them. Which meant Steck had been doing this for a while. Not to kill, not yet, but to produce the kind of degraded performance that created genuine training accidents. Accidents that could be documented, accidents that could explain the injuries. The whole architecture of the fraud was built on making the operators fail in ways that looked like their own bodies giving out under legitimate stress. She thought about Pruitt's shoulder wound, about the angle and depth that didn't match training ammunition. There had been at least one deviation from that model, at least one time where the mechanism had been more direct, or where something had gone wrong enough that the accident and fog pattern wasn't sufficient. Tanner. She realized she'd been quiet on the phone for too long. His breathing is slower, Tanner said, more regular. He opened his eyes, both of them. Is he responding to his name? Yeah, he said my name. He sounds rough, but he said it. The atropine was working, not solving Wilk. They would need to get Reyes to a hospital for full decontamination support and monitoring, because the compound was still in his system and the auto-injector dose would wear off. But working enough to pull him back from the edge of the cliff, Steck had pushed him toward. She let out a slow breath. Keep him on his side. Keep him still. We are 15 minutes out. Hale took a turn faster than was comfortable onto a dirt access road that wasn't on any GPS navigable map, and that Odom had apparently remembered from his own time at the facility. The vehicle moved through scrub and tree cover and came out on a service perimeter road that ran along the back fence of what looked, from the outside, like a property used for agricultural storage. Chain-link fence, no visible signage. 2 equipment sheds and a main building that was clearly more substantial than its exterior suggested. Reinforced walls, ventilation systems on the roof that didn't fit the agricultural story. A white contractor medical vehicle was parked near the rear fence with its driver's door open. Hale braked. "Steck's vehicle," Odom said. "He's still here." Hale had his phone up, texting. "Or he left in something else." "If he's still here, he has access to whatever else he brought," Natalie said. She was already out of the vehicle before it had fully stopped, kit in hand, moving toward the far field where Tanner had described Rhea's position, 150 meters from the main building across open ground. She could see them now, 2 figures on the ground, one prone on his side, one kneeling beside him. She covered the distance fast and arrived breathing hard, dropped to her knees beside Rhea's, and started her assessment from the beginning. He was conscious, looking at her with the unfocused exhaustion of a person whose nervous system had just been through a significant insult, but he was breathing at a rate she could work with, and his pupils had partially dilated back from the severe meiosis Tanner had described. "I'm Natalie. I'm a medic. I'm going to take care of you." He said something that might have been okay, or might have just been an exhalation. She took his pulse, 92, stronger than she'd feared. Respiratory rate had come down to 18. The atropine had bought them time. Not a lot of time, but enough for what came next. Tanner was beside her, watching with the expression of someone who had just done something they weren't sure they were capable of and was still processing the fact that it had worked. He was pale, and there was sweat on his temple that wasn't entirely from the October sun. "You're symptomatic too," she said. "I'm okay." "You're not, but you're early. Sit down and stay down." She pulled the second auto-injector from the kit pouch and looked at him steadily. "Your choice. But you know what I'm going to tell you." He sat down. She administered the second injector and noted the time. Behind her, she could hear Hale's voice carrying across the field. Not his words, just the tone of someone managing multiple simultaneous situations. And then a different sound that took her a moment to identify. A vehicle. Not arriving. Departing. The engine note of something larger than a passenger vehicle moving away from the facility on the far side. She looked up. Odom was running toward the main building. "Hale," she called. He was already moving toward the fence line. She stayed with Reyes and Tanner, because that was the actual call. The one she'd already made. The one she kept making regardless of what else was happening around her. You stayed with your patients. You didn't abandon the men in front of you for the man who was running. Steck could run. The NCIS team was arriving in less than 20 hours, and his medical waste was still in the facility, and his falsified documentation was in the hands of a federal investigation and a suspended nurse who had seen both his work and the consequences of it firsthand. Running was the worst thing he could do for himself, and probably the thing he most needed to feel like he was doing something. She held Reyes's wrist and counted. 12 minutes later, the sound of rotors came from the south. A military helicopter came in over the tree line and set down on the access road with the efficiency of an aircraft that had been told exactly where to land and exactly why. 2 medics in uniform were out before the skids fully settled, moving toward her position with equipment bags that made her own kit look like a first aid box. She gave them the handoff with the same clean, compressed precision she'd used in a dozen field transfers. Compound, route, time of administration, current vitals, response to atropine, second patient 15 meters away. One of the medics was already on her knees beside Reyes before the report was finished. The other moved to Tanner without being directed. Natalie stood up. Her knees were stiff from the ground. Her scrubs had grass stains, and she was aware, distantly, that she was a suspended civilian nurse who had just administered military field medications to active-duty operators outside any institutional authorization, and that the paperwork dimension of this situation was going to be its own particular mountain. She also didn't care very much about that right now. Hale was coming back across the field. His expression told her Steck had not been in the departing vehicle, or if he had been, they hadn't been able to stop it. "Steck?" she said. "Gone." Someone was waiting for him on the east access road. 2-vehicle convoy, moved fast. He looked at the helicopter, at the medics working on Reyes. Calloway has the description. Roadblocks are going up. He'll have a plan. He didn't run without one. Yeah. Hale looked at her. Hale, are they going to be okay? She looked at Reyes, who was now on supplemental oxygen with an IV running in his arm and the color coming back into his face in the incremental way that meant the body was remembering how to function properly. Tanner was upright and talking to the second medic, still pale but present, his hands braced on his knees like a man who had decided that posture was the thing keeping him together. They're going to be okay, she said. It wasn't certainty. Nothing in medicine was certainty, but it was a reasonable probability stated plainly, which was the most she'd ever promised anyone. They got back to Crestwood Falls at 2 in the afternoon. Calloway was waiting at the safe house on Dellard Street, this time in uniform. The first time Natalie had seen her in one, and it clarified something about the situation that the civilian clothes had left slightly ambiguous. This wasn't an informal coordination anymore. This was command authority, officially present, and the shift had a meaning. 2 other people were with her, a woman in her late 30s with a federal ID badge, who introduced herself as Special Agent Dorinda Marsh, NCIS, and a man from the state attorney's office named Pittman, who had the careful manner of someone already drafting indictment language in his head. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Natalie gave her account in the order they asked for it: Odom's initial presentation 6 weeks ago, Pruitt's trauma bay presentation and the wound pattern discrepancy, the suspension and the Varel legal counsel's call, the meeting at the Meridian, the field response to Reyes and Tanner. She gave it once, without embellishment, with the dates and times as precise as she could make them, and the clinical observations stated as clinical observations rather than conclusions. She let the conclusions be theirs. Marsh asked good questions. She asked them in the way of someone who had already done significant preparation and was verifying rather than discovering, which confirmed that the investigation had more legs than what Calloway had shown her this morning. The whiteboard on the wall grew more lines while they talked, and the red marker spent more time on Owen Steck's name and less time on the dotted line leading to Harold. Harold Steck has been cooperating since 9 this morning, Calloway told her during a brief break while Marsh took a call. When NCIS made initial contact, he handed over 6 months of incident documentation without being asked. He didn't know about his brother's contractor arrangement when it started. He figured it out approximately 3 months ago. And didn't report it, Natalie said. He didn't report it. Calloway looked at her steadily. He's not a villain in this story. He's a man who found something he didn't want to look at and looked away, which is its own kind of failure with its own kind of consequence. What does that mean for his position at Harwick? That's not mine to determine. The hospital board will make that call based on what the investigation produces. It was a fair answer. Natalie had known people like Harold Steck before, people who were fundamentally decent, operating in structures that made looking away the path of least resistance, and who eventually looked away from something that mattered. He hadn't tried to ruin her, probably. He had just let the machinery run. The machinery had nearly killed a man and nearly buried the evidence, and his failure to stop it was the kind of failure that didn't disappear because the intent was absent. Dennis Farr, the gray suit from the suspension meeting, had been picked up by local police at the Crestwood Falls Airport at 11 that morning, attempting to board a connecting flight to a city that was not his registered home address. His phone had been seized. The contents of that phone, Marsh told her with the measured tone of someone making a point carefully, would be part of the federal filing. Owen Steck was still unlocated as of 2 p.m. The roadblocks had not intercepted the convoy. He had resources and a head start, and someone who had been planning an exit route for him, which meant that part of the story was not resolved and might not be resolved quickly. Natalie sat with that. She didn't like it, but she'd learned a long time ago that not every situation resolved within the window you wanted it to resolve, and the parts you couldn't control were the parts you stopped allocating energy to. By 5 o'clock, Marsh and Pittman were gone, and Calloway was the only other person in the warehouse. Natalie was sitting on the edge of the folding table with a cup of coffee from a machine she hadn't known was in the building until Odom had found it during a search for something to do with his hands. The coffee was bad. She was grateful for it. "Your house has been cleared," Calloway said. "No entry was made. FAR pulled your address from the system, but it doesn't appear that anyone acted on it before he was picked up. Okay. You can go home. She nodded. She thought about that. The clean kitchen, the small table, the go bag in the closet, all of it intact and waiting for the version of her that existed before this morning's suspension and before the Meridian Diner and before the field at the training facility. She wasn't sure that version was still current. Your suspension, Calloway said. Harwick's legal team has been informed of the federal investigation. Wren called Voss at 3 o'clock. The hospital's official position as of this afternoon is that the suspension is under review pending investigation outcomes. Under review means it still stands. For now, yes, but the board meets next week and the narrative has shifted significantly. Calloway paused. Steck, Harold, submitted an amendment to his incident report this afternoon. He documented that the needle decompression performed by the nursing staff was clinically indicated and likely life-saving, and that the decision to exclude the nurse from the trauma bay prior to cardiac arrest was an error of judgment on his part. Natalie stared at her coffee. He didn't have to do that, she said. No. He could have let the investigation do it. Yes. He chose not to wait. Calloway looked at her with the measured assessment of someone who had been evaluating people for a long time and had arrived at a conclusion she hadn't fully voiced yet. You have options here, Brooks. Not just the option of going home and waiting for the board. Real options, the kind that involve using what you are instead of suppressing it. You're offering me something. I'm telling you something exists to offer. The specifics need to go through proper channels, and those channels don't open until the investigation clears, which is at minimum 6 weeks out. She didn't look away. But the people who are going to be sitting across that table from you in 6 weeks are not going to be Patricia Wren and a risk management department. They're going to be people who know your record and watched what you did in a field in October in your work scrubs with 2 auto-injectors and a phone. Natalie thought about Marcus Webb, about the training changes she'd made and never known had stayed in place, about the qualification course, the candidates, the years of work that she'd cut off and walked away from because the cost of staying had felt too high. She thought about Garrett Hale, who had gone through that course the year after Webb died and come out the other side owing his competence, at least in part, to adjustments made by someone whose name he hadn't known. Some things stayed in place even after you left. She hadn't expected that. She wasn't sure what to do with it. I'll hear what they have to offer, she said. Calloway nodded. That was enough for now. Natalie set down the coffee cup and picked up her keys. The drive back to Caldwell Street was the same 11 minutes it always was. Mercer Avenue, right on Caldwell, the sprinkler still running on the broken timer. She parked in the driveway and sat for a moment in the gray Honda with the engine off. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unrecognized number, not the same format as Calloway's messages, not a Crestwood Falls area code. She almost dismissed it. Then she read it. We have an arrangement you should know about before you speak to federal agents again. There are aspects of what happened to Marcus Webb that the investigation did not include. I have the documentation. This conversation should happen privately. O. Steck. She read it twice. Owen Steck. Unlocated, in flight, running from a federal investigation, and his first move was not to go dark. His first move was to reach out to her. With Marcus Webb's name, she sat in the driveway of her house on Caldwell Street and looked at the screen and felt the particular cold clarity of someone who understood exactly what was happening. Steck wasn't offering information. He was dangling leverage. He was telling her that there existed something she didn't know about the worst event of her career, and that the price of knowing it was her silence on everything she'd seen. It was a calculated move, targeted precisely at the wound she'd never fully closed, and the fact that he had the specific name, had reached her with it within hours of going into hiding. That meant the information was real, or real enough to be weaponized. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Then she called Calloway. It rang twice. I just got a text from Owen Steck, she said. He has something about Marcus Webb. He says he has documentation the investigation didn't include. Silence for 1 full second. Don't respond to it, Calloway said. Not yet. Stay where you are. Calloway. I know. Her voice was quiet now, stripped of the command register. I know. I need you to trust me for the next 12 hours. What aren't you telling me? Another silence. longer. The investigation into Marcus Webb's death, Calloway said, was closed administratively. The formal finding was cardiac. But 18 months ago, a contractor medical file was flagged in an unrelated audit, a file that referenced a pharmacological trial being run on SOCOM candidates without their informed consent. The trial documentation listed a supervising medical officer. She stopped. Natalie already knew. Owen Steck, she said. He was a military contractor before Varel. He ran supplemental pharmaceutical research on the qualification course under a classified research protocol. The trial was on performance enhancement compounds. Webb was in the cohort. Calloway's voice was careful. Exact. The cardiac event that killed him may not have been unrelated to that compound. The pre-existing condition found at autopsy may have been masked before the course began. The sprinkler ran in the neighbor's yard. The streetlight came on. The ordinary street did the ordinary things it did every evening. Natalie sat in the dark car with her hands on the wheel and the phone against her ear, and the understanding settling into her like cold water rising, that Marcus Webb had not died because she had missed something in her screening, that the pre-existing condition the investigation had found had been a pre-existing condition created by someone else's intervention, that the thing she had been carrying for 6 years, the specific shape of guilt and failure she had built her entire reinvention around, was built on a foundation that Steck had laid and the investigation had never uncovered. And Steck knew she would need to know that, which meant he thought it would stop her. She closed her eyes for a moment, then she opened them. "Calloway," she said, "I want him." "Calloway," she said, "I want him." Calloway didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice carried the weight of someone who had been holding a piece of information for 18 months and had just watched it become load-bearing in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. "I know," she said. "We're going to get him, but not the way he wants you to come after him. He thinks this gives him leverage. He thinks the name Marcus Webb is a hand he can play, and he's counting on you being so destabilized by what I just told you that you either go quiet or you go rogue, and either way, he gets a version of events he can manage." A pause. "So we don't do either of those things." "What do we do?" "You go inside your house. You get some sleep. And at 7 tomorrow morning, when the NCIS team formally convenes, you walk in there and give them everything, including that text, including this phone call, including every clinical observation you've made in the last 6 weeks. You give them the case they need to build, and you let them build it." It sounded insufficient. It sounded like the answer that people gave when the available options were limited, and patience was the only one with a viable outcome. She understood that. She also understood that she was sitting in a dark car running on 4 hours of sleep and adrenaline residue, and the knowledge that the guilt she'd organized her entire second life around had been manufactured by the same man who'd poisoned 2 operators this morning and fled a federal investigation. Understanding something and feeling it settle were different processes that didn't run on the same timeline. "Okay," she said. She went inside. She did not sleep well. That was true and worth saying. She lay in the dark of her bedroom on Caldwell Street, and the information moved through her in waves, the way significant information did when the mind was trying to integrate it into a framework that had been built on different terms. Marcus Webb had been 24 years old. He had been healthy, had passed every prior screen, had been in the second week of a qualification course that should have challenged him without killing him. She had reviewed her pre-course assessment of him 100 times in the years since, and found nothing she should have caught because there had been nothing there to catch. His cardiac event had been attributed to a congenital abnormality that had somehow evaded prior screening. She had believed that. She had believed it and still left, because believing it hadn't been enough to stop her from feeling responsible, and feeling responsible had been enough to stop her from continuing. What Calloway had told her tonight didn't erase the grief of that. It reframed it into something different, not her failure, but someone else's crime, and herself as the person who had carried the weight of it for 6 years while the man who'd caused it ran a private medical contract and poisoned soldiers for money. She didn't know yet whether anger was cleaner than guilt. It was more energizing. She'd find out what it cost later. At 6:45, she got up, showered, put on the plainest clothes she owned, dark jeans, a gray pullover, and drove to the federal building on Harwick Avenue where the NCIS field office had set up its coordination space in a conference room on the third floor. Marsh was already there. So was a second agent she hadn't met, a man named Levi Torrance, who had the build of someone who had spent time in the military before the badge and the quiet manner of someone who had learned to listen before he talked. Calloway was there in uniform. Hale was there, sitting in the corner with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, and at the far end of the table, looking like a man who had not slept and had arrived at a decision he wasn't comfortable with and had made it anyway, was Harold Steck. She stopped when she saw him. He looked up. The reckoning in his face was not performance. It was the real thing, the particular exhaustion of a person who had spent months looking away from something and had finally turned around and seen the full shape of what they'd allowed. "I asked to be here," he said. "Marsh said it was your call." She looked at him for a moment. Then she walked to the table and sat down 2 seats away from him, which was close enough to acknowledge and far enough to be honest. "Then stay," she said. The deposition took 4 hours. She was thorough. Not because thoroughness was comfortable. It wasn't, especially the sections covering Marcus Webb, which Marsh navigated with a careful, specific decency that Natalie had not expected and was grateful for, but because thoroughness was the thing that built cases that held. She gave every date, every clinical observation, every conversation she could reconstruct with accuracy, flagged clearly what was direct knowledge and what was inference, and let Marsh and Torrance draw their own lines between the data points. Harold Steck gave his own account in the session that followed hers. She was not in the room for it, but Calloway briefed her afterward in the corridor. He had documented his awareness of his brother's contract arrangement, the timeline of when he'd understood the nature of it, and the specific pressure Owen had applied to keep him from reporting. It was not a heroic account. It was an honest one, which, in the circumstances, was worth more. The question of what it meant for his position at Harwick General was, as Calloway had said, not hers to answer. The hospital board would convene, the record would be examined. Harold Steck would live with what he'd chosen and what he hadn't, and that was how accountability worked when it worked. Not neatly, not without remainder, but with the full weight of documented fact. At noon, Marsh walked into the corridor where Natalie was sitting with a cup of coffee that was better than the Fieldhouse machine but still not good, and said, "Owen Steck was picked up at a private airfield in Garner County at 10:40 this morning." The sentence landed quietly. He was attempting to board a charter flight with a Canadian destination under a secondary identity. The secondary identity was not well constructed, apparently. The airfield operator had concerns and made a call. Marsh paused. "He's in federal custody. His legal counsel has already indicated he intends to cooperate in exchange for sentencing consideration. That process is going to take time, but the cooperation changes the timeline significantly." Natalie looked at her coffee. "The documentation he texted you about," Marsh continued, "the web files. He had them. Physical documents in a lockbox in the charter aircraft. Our people have them." A beat. "They're consistent with what Calloway told you last night. There was a pharmacological trial. Webb was in the cohort. The compound used was an experimental acetylcholinesterase modulator, the same class as what he administered to Reyes and Tanner. The same class. Different dose, different duration, different intent, but the same fundamental mechanism. Steck had spent years refining the application of a compound he'd first used experimentally on candidates in a qualification course, and Marcus Webb had been the experiment that went wrong, and the investigation that followed had found a pre-existing condition because the pre-existing condition had been caused by the compound and nobody had been looking for that specific chain of causation. She set the coffee down. Her hands were steady. She noticed that. "What happens to the Webb case?" she said. "It gets reopened. Federal jurisdiction given the military nexus and the contractor involvement. The formal finding will be amended." Marsh looked at her directly. "You'll be notified when the amendment is filed. The record will reflect what actually happened." It wouldn't bring him back. She knew that, and she wasn't confused about it. The reopening of an investigation and the amendment of a finding were administrative acts, not restorative ones. Marcus Webb was still 24 years old and still dead, and that was the permanent fact that nothing that happened in a federal conference room was going to change. But the administrative record had mattered to her. She hadn't known how much until right now, sitting in a corridor in a federal building with a bad cup of coffee, understanding that the version of events that had been on paper for 6 years was going to be corrected. That his family, if they chose to know, could know what had actually happened to him. That she had not missed something. That she had never missed something. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that was too specific to explain. Commit. The Harwick General Board met the following Thursday. The suspension review was on the agenda as a secondary item, which told her something about how the institution was managing the optics of the situation. The federal investigation was the primary story, and the nurse who had defied an attending physician was the secondary story that was now uncomfortably entangled with it. Patricia Wren called her the morning before the meeting. "I want to be direct with you," Wren said. "Please. The board's position going into tomorrow is complicated. What you did in that trauma bay was clinically correct and likely life-saving. The record now clearly establishes that. It also remains true that you performed an invasive procedure over the explicit direction of the attending, which is a scope of practice issue regardless of the outcome." A pause. "What the board is going to have to sit with is the fact that if you had not done what you did, the outcome would have been different. That the procedure was unauthorized and the outcome was correct are simultaneously true." "I know that," Natalie said. "I'm not sure how they're going to land on it. I wanted you to know that before you walked in." It was, she thought, the most honest thing Wren had said to her. More honest than the suspension letter. More honest than the risk management framing in the original meeting. She appreciated it. "Whatever they decide," Natalie said, "the record stands." "Yes," Wren said. "It does." The board meeting lasted 2 hours. Natalie sat in a waiting area outside the conference room for the first 90 minutes of it, which gave her time to think and not think and look at the hospital that had been her professional home for 3 years. The nurses at the station down the hall, running their shifts with the steady, underappreciated competence that the building ran on. The orderly pushing a medication cart with the slightly too fast walk of someone behind schedule. The family in the corner chairs holding coffee cups, and the particular tension of people waiting for news. She had been part of this building. She had done good work in it, even when the work was the small, ordinary work of monitoring and documenting and flagging things quietly and staying in her lane. She didn't regret those 3 years. She had needed them to be what they were. The period in which she was just a nurse, just someone who showed up and did the job and carried nothing unusual. That period was over. She wasn't sure she regretted that either. At the 90-minute mark, Voss appeared in the corridor. He looked like a man who had been in a tense room for an extended period and was managing it with the practicality of someone who didn't have the option of not managing it. He walked toward her and sat down in the chair beside her, which was not something she'd expected. "They're going back and forth," he said. "For what it's worth, I gave a statement to the board yesterday. Written. About the clinical sequence in the bay. What I observed, what the findings were at each stage." He looked at the floor. "I wrote that your assessment of the patient was accurate and that the outcome supports your clinical judgment. I also wrote that you were right and I was wrong to remove you from that bay." She looked at him. He wasn't comfortable saying it. That discomfort was part of what made it worth saying. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." He shifted in the chair. "I've been a charge nurse for 11 years. Part of that job is managing the hierarchy so the floor runs. Part of it is knowing when the hierarchy is wrong." He paused. "I got that wrong. I knew you were good at what you did, and I still treated the attending's authority as more important than what you were seeing. That is on me, and I wanted it in the record." She nodded. There wasn't a lot more to say to that. It was an honest accounting, and adding to it would have made it smaller, turned it into a conversation when it was meant to be a statement. The door to the conference room opened. The board chair, a cardiologist named Dr. Eunice Farrar, who Natalie had seen in the building perhaps a dozen times in 3 years, walked out with the expression of someone who had made a decision they could defend and had arrived at that position through genuine deliberation rather than institutional self-protection. "Ms. Brooks," she said, "come in, please." The room held 7 board members, a legal representative, and Patricia Wren at a side table. Harold Steck was not present, which made sense. He was managing his own situation, and his attendance would have complicated the optics of what was supposed to be a governance proceeding rather than a public reckoning. Farrar sat at the head of the table and looked at Natalie directly. The board has reviewed the full record, she said. The clinical documentation, Dr. Steck's amended incident report, charge nurse Voss's written statement, the NCIS investigative summary as it relates to events at this institution, and the State Nursing Board's preliminary review, which has indicated it will defer to this proceeding before finalizing its own determination. She folded her hands. The board's finding is as follows. Natalie sat still. The suspension is lifted, effective immediately. The incident report will be amended to reflect that the clinical intervention performed by Ms. Brooks was appropriate, indicated, and life-saving. The State Nursing Board will receive a formal communication from this institution supporting the full restoration of Ms. Brooks' nursing license without condition. Farrar paused. The board also wishes to acknowledge, formally and on the record, that the failure to act on Ms. Brooks's clinical assessments in Trauma Bay 1 on the night of October 14th contributed to a near-fatal deterioration in the patient's condition, and that this institution's cultural deference to physician authority over credible nursing judgment represents a systemic issue that will be addressed through a comprehensive review of our trauma protocols. The room was quiet. That review, Farrar continued, will be led by a committee that includes senior nursing staff at the clinical lead level. We are asking Ms. Brooks, if she is willing, to participate in that committee in an advisory capacity. Natalie looked at the table for a moment, at her own hands on the surface of it. Advisory capacity. It was a careful phrase, not a reinstatement to a previous role, not an elevation, but an invitation. A request to help fix what was broken in the building that had suspended her. It was imperfect. The situation was imperfect. Most real outcomes were. I'm willing, she said. The committee work started the week after. It was slow, detailed, and frequently frustrating. The particular frustration of institutional change, which moved like water through rock and required patience that Natalie had in some areas and not in others. She was not always diplomatic. There were meetings where she said things directly that the room would have preferred softened, and at least one session where a senior physician left before it concluded because the conversation had gone somewhere he hadn't expected and he hadn't been willing to stay for it. She didn't chase him. He came back the following week. Reyes was discharged from the military medical center 11 days after the field incident. Tanner had been cleared for duty 4 days earlier. She learned this from Hale, who called her on a Tuesday evening with the particular slightly awkward tone of someone who had a reason to call and was figuring out how to handle the fact that they had a reason. I wanted you to know, he said. I'm glad they're okay. A beat. I went through the qualification course 18 months after Marcus Webb died. I didn't know his name at the time. The instructors didn't talk about it. But the course had changed. The screening was different, more thorough. There was a 24-hour observation window that nobody explained and nobody questioned because the instructors ran it like it had always been there. He paused. There was a guy in my class named Okafor. 31 years old, looked healthy, passed the standard screening. The extended observation caught something. I don't know exactly what. I was a candidate. I wasn't read into the medical findings. But he was pulled from the course and referred for evaluation. He came back the following cycle and completed it. Another pause. He's currently assigned to a team in the Pacific. He's got a wife and a 3-year-old. She sat with that for a moment. A man she had never met, who was alive and had a child, because a protocol she'd instituted in the worst period of her professional life had caught something on a day when she wasn't there to catch it herself. It was not a resolution. It was not the clean, satisfying arc of cause and consequence that stories sometimes offered. It was just a fact, quiet, specific, and weightless, in the way that the most important things sometimes were, because they didn't announce themselves, and they didn't require witness to be real. Thank you for telling me, she said. Thank you for what you did, he said. On the training field and the other stuff. All of it. She laughed briefly, a short, real sound. You blocked my access to the patient, she said, in the trauma bay. You angled your body so Steck couldn't pull me away before I could complete the decompression. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. I was just standing there. Right, she said. They talked for another few minutes, and then the call ended the way most calls ended. Not dramatically, just naturally, the conversation concluding because it had arrived at its own end. She put the phone down and sat in her kitchen at the small table by the window where she could see the street. The same chair she'd sat in the night the text from Callaway first arrived, and the view was exactly the same. Streetlight, neighbor's yard. The quiet, ordinary passage of an evening in a neighborhood that didn't know anything unusual had happened. Except the sprinkler had been fixed. Someone had finally gotten to the broken timer. Small things changed. That was how it mostly worked. Owen Steck's cooperation agreement was formalized 6 weeks after his arrest. The charges were federal: conducting unauthorized pharmacological trials on military personnel, falsification of government contractor medical records, conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, and 1 count of aggravated assault for the administration of the organophosphate compound to Reyes and Tanner. The cooperation reduced the exposure. It did not eliminate it. His legal counsel negotiated as well as legal counsel could negotiate when the documentary evidence was comprehensive and the client had been caught at an airfield with a secondary identity and a lockbox full of records he should have destroyed. He entered a guilty plea to 4 of the 6 charges. The sentencing hearing was set for the spring. The guidelines range was significant. Verrill Medical Group's contract with the training facility was terminated the day after Steck's arrest. The company's operating license in 3 states was suspended, pending a full regulatory review. Dennis Farr, who had provided material assistance to the obstruction effort, negotiated his own plea arrangement and faced separate civil liability from the operators who had been harmed. Raymond Gill, the legal counsel who had called Natalie in a parking lot and offered her money to stay quiet, found his firm's name in a federal filing that made for unpleasant reading in every bar association newsletter that covered it. Harold Steck resigned from his position as attending physician at Harwick General in November. The resignation was described in the official communication as voluntary and in pursuit of other professional opportunities, which was the institutional language for a departure that was mutual in the way that departures were mutual when the person leaving understood that staying would require a sustained engagement with their own compromised history. He went into private practice in a smaller city upstate. Whether that was a punishment or a reprieve was probably a question only he could answer, and probably not for a while. The Webb case was formally reopened in November, and the amended finding was filed in December. The amendment documented the unauthorized pharmacological trial, identified the compound as causally related to the fatal cardiac event, and reclassified Marcus Webb's death from natural causes with contributing congenital factors to death, resulting from unauthorized medical experimentation by a military contractor without informed consent. His family was notified. Natalie received a copy of the amended finding by certified mail on a Wednesday morning. She read it at the kitchen table. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer with her passport and the lease and the other documents that constituted the paper architecture of her life. She sat there for a while, not grieving. She had done that, fully and thoroughly, over a period of years, and what she felt now was something different. Not relief, exactly. Closer to a weightlifting that she had stopped noticing because it had been present so long it had become indistinguishable from her own density. She felt lighter in a way that was almost disorienting, the way that people felt when something that had been pressing on them removed itself and they had to relearn their own posture. She had not killed Marcus Webb. She had known that intellectually for some time. She had not known it the way she knew it now, in her body, in the specific architecture of the guilt she'd carried, the particular rooms of it that had been locked since she was 26 years old, and standing over a candidate who had stopped breathing and had not started again. The rooms didn't disappear. That would have been too clean, and she had learned not to expect clean. But they weren't locked anymore. Okay. In February, Callaway called. The offer she'd referenced in the Dellard Street warehouse had gone through the proper channels, as promised. The channels had produced paperwork, and the paperwork had produced a meeting, and the meeting had produced a formal proposal that Natalie had read twice and sat with for 3 days before responding. The role was with a joint SOCOM civilian medical advisory program, newly established, designed to address the gap that the Vorel investigation had exposed: the absence of independent medical oversight on private contractor operations supporting military training environments. The position would carry civilian authority with military access, responsible for developing and enforcing medical standards for contractor personnel, and reviewing incident documentation across multiple facilities. It was, among other things, the exact kind of role that would have prevented everything that happened over the previous 4 months if it had existed before. It was also the exact kind of role she had spent 3 years trying not to think about wanting. She called Calloway back on the 4th day. "I have conditions," she said. "I expected you would. The Harwick Committee work finishes first. The protocol review is 6 weeks from completion. I'm not leaving that half done. We can work with that timeline. And the medical standards framework for the program. I want direct input, not advisory, authorship." A pause. "That will require a conversation with the program directors." "Then have that conversation. Because the reason a gap like this existed is that the people designing medical oversight frameworks for contractor operations didn't include the people who actually do the medicine. That is not a structural feature I'm willing to replicate." Calloway was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll have that conversation. One more thing." "Go ahead." "The extended observation protocol from the SOMC qualification course, the one implemented after Webb died. I want it reviewed and potentially adapted for the new contractor oversight standards." A longer pause. "You know that protocol was implemented without formal authorization." "I know. I want it formalized. That will require going through the course medical standards board." "I know that too." She looked out the kitchen window, the neighbor's yard still fixed, the sprinkler dormant in February. "I spent 6 years thinking I'd left medicine behind. I didn't. And the work I did before I left, the work I was ashamed of because I thought it had cost a life, it saved lives. I need that work to be on the record, not for me. Because if it's not on record, the next person who does the right thing without authorization can be just as easy to erase as I was." The silence on the line was different from Calloway's calculating silences. It was the silence of someone who had underestimated the depth of what they were dealing with and was recalibrating. "I'll make it happen," Calloway said. The last day of the committee work at Harwick General was a Thursday in March. The trauma protocol revision was complete, a 30-page document that changed how clinical disagreements were escalated in the trauma bay, established a formal mechanism for nursing staff to flag dissenting clinical assessments without fear of removal from the case, and required documented acknowledgement of those flags before the attending could override them. It was not a revolution. It was a mechanism. Mechanisms were what kept the right thing from depending entirely on whether the right people were in the room. She walked out of the building at 6 in the evening with the same bag she'd carried every day for 3 years, through the same lobby, past the same security desk where she'd surrendered her badge in October. The desk attendant, a middle-aged man named Gill who had worked that post for 8 years and made excellent small talk about baseball, looked up. "Heard you're moving on," he said. "Next week. Gonna be different around here." "It's going to be the same," she said. "That's the point. The work doesn't leave with a person. It's supposed to stay in the building." He nodded like that made sense, which it did, and she walked out through the automatic doors into a March evening that was cold but not unpleasantly so. The specific cold of a season turning, winter losing its grip without admitting it yet. Voss was outside. She hadn't expected him. He was standing on the sidewalk in his street clothes, which meant he'd waited after his shift ended, and he had the expression of a man who had something to say and had been marshalling it. "The new attending they brought in for the trauma rotation," he said. "Castellano. First week on the floor, she came to me with a concern about a patient assessment that the lead resident had dismissed. I pulled the chart. She was right." Natalie waited. "I told the resident that her assessment was being documented and that if it turned out to be correct, we would be discussing why it had been dismissed. And then it turned out to be correct." He paused. "Different outcome than October. Better process." "Good," she said. "That's because of you." She looked at him. "That's because you changed how you handled it. I didn't do that. You did." He accepted that without arguing it, which told her he'd thought about it enough to know it was true. They shook hands in the way that people shook hands when the gesture was slightly inadequate for the actual content of the moment, but was the available currency. Then she walked to the gray Honda and put her bag on the passenger seat and sat for a moment in the parking structure. She thought about the woman who had parked here in October, arriving early to a suspension meeting, badge in her pocket, The whole quiet architecture of 3 years of deliberate invisibility still intact. The woman who had spent years being exactly unremarkable enough to stay safe, and who had watched a man's chest collapse on a table and made the only call she'd ever actually known how to make. She didn't know if she was a better version of herself now or just a more visible one. Probably both. Probably neither was the right frame. What she knew was that the work she'd run from had found her anyway. Not to punish her, but because good work had a way of surfacing. It came up through the ground like water finding its level, regardless of what structures you built to redirect it. She had tried to redirect herself into something smaller and quieter, and it had worked right up until it didn't, and what had broken through wasn't the old version of herself demanding restoration. It was just the truth. The plain specific truth of what she knew and what she could do, and what happened when someone in a room needed those things, and she was the only one who had them. She started the car. The drive out of the structure, down Mercer Avenue, right on Caldwell. She took it one more time, the 11-minute route she had driven every day for 3 years, because it was still her route for one more week, and some things deserved to be taken all the way to their end. She pulled into the driveway of the house on Caldwell Street, sat in the quiet. Here was the thing that nobody told you about being dismissed, underestimated, pushed to the margins, and told your lane was elsewhere. It didn't work. Not permanently. Not on people who had built their competence in the kind of rooms where competence was the only thing between the living and the dead. You could take the badge. You could remove the rank. You could suspend the license and question the authority and stand between someone and the patient they were trying to save. What you couldn't do was take the knowledge. It stayed in the hands. It stayed in the eyes. It stayed in the specific quality of attention that some people developed over years of working where the stakes were absolute and the margin for error was zero. You could push that person out of the room 100 times, and it would still be there when the monitors alarmed and the room needed someone who already knew what to do. She had tried to put it down. It had waited. And when it had surfaced, in a trauma bay in the middle of the night, in a field in October with 2 contaminated men and an auto-injector and a phone, it had not surfaced as something exceptional. It had surfaced as something ordinary, as the thing she simply was underneath everything else, regardless of what scrubs she wore or what building she worked in or whether anyone in the room had any idea who she was. The title was never the thing. It had never been the thing. She got out of the car, walked to the front door, paused with her hand on the door frame for a moment, looking at the quiet street, the fixed sprinkler, the ordinary neighborhood that had held her life in place while she figured out what to do with it. Then she went inside and started packing. Not because she was running, because she was ready. There was a difference, and she had finally learned to tell them apart.